From tomorrow, Singapore will exit the circuit breaker and begin our journey to resume activities progressively and safely. More economic activities will be allowed to start, and more workers will be allowed to return to work. Later on today, Ministry of Manpower and Ministry of National Development will talk about migrant worker housing going forward. Higher activities is also likely to increase people-to-people contact at workplace as well as in the community. Therefore, safe distancing measures, personal hygiene, and the use of masks will become even more important to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. The multi-ministry task force has reviewed the use of masks vis-à-vis face shields. We know that COVID-19 is spread predominantly through droplets. While face shields may provide some protection, the design of face shields typically leaves a gap between the face and the shield, which means that the wearer could still be depositing droplets. This is unlike masks. With effect from 2nd of June, we expect greater community interaction and contacts among people, including on the public transport. Therefore, the use of masks will become the default. The use of face shields in place of masks will only be allowed for specific exam groups or settings where the wearing of masks may not be practical, such as teaching, or may not be safe, such as for those with medical conditions. We will allow face shields to be worn instead for these specific exemptions. Director of Medical Services, Professor Mark, will share more on these rules later on. We will continue to exercise flexibility in the enforcement for groups that may have difficulties wearing face masks. Even as the circuit breaker ends, we appeal to everyone to continue to stay at home and avoid going out except for essential services, as well as to buy essential items, or to work where telecommuting is not possible. As there will be fewer restrictions when the circuit breaker comes to an end, the role of individuals will become even more critical. If each of us play our part, act responsibly, we can keep the community transmission low and move together safely towards a new normal. Now I'd like to invite my Director of Medical Services, Professor Mark, to give an update on the medical side, as well as to elaborate on the mask policy.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'll start off by talking a little bit about the number of new cases we have today. And as of the 1st of June 2020, the Ministry of Health has preliminarily confirmed an additional 408 new cases of COVID-19 infection in Singapore, all of whom are work pass holders residing in foreign worker dormitories. Based on the investigations we have so far, there are no cases in the community to report today. More details will be provided in the update that will come out later tonight. As the Minister has alluded to, we have been reviewing our guidance concerning the use of masks and face shields, and this is in particular given that tomorrow will mark the milestone where we will move away from our circuit breaker set of restrictions, and we anticipate more people coming out into the community and circulating. While we continue to emphasize safe distancing measures to be undertaken, and we believe this still to be very important, we think on the basis of being more cautious, we should also review our use of masks and face shields. And because of our review, we've made a decision that we would no longer treat face shields the same as masks. Face shields cannot replace masks in the majority of settings in which we require facial protection to prevent ourselves, if we were asymptomatic but infected, from exposing others to infection. So masks will be the default situation. However, as the Minister has alluded to, in some situations where the wearing of masks may not be practical, face shields may be worn instead. Face shields may continue, however, to augment the use of masks, but the mask wearing would be the default. If a face shield is worn, a face shield has to be worn in such a way that it's worn properly to cover the entire face from the forehead to below the chin, wrapping around the sides of the face. And those who can wear face shields would be children, 12 years and below, who have difficulty weaning off wearing masks or keeping the face mask on for prolonged periods of time. Secondly, people who have health conditions that may result in breathing difficulties or other medical difficulties when the mask is worn for prolonged periods of time would be allowed to wear a face shield instead of the mask. The third setting where we would exempt people from wearing a mask by default would be for people who are speaking to a group in a classroom or lecture style setting where they are largely remaining in a single spot from which they are speaking and are able to maintain a safe distance away from other people. We currently exempt persons and individuals doing television broadcasts from having to wear face masks or face shields. And we will continue with this exemption, provided such activities are done in a safe and controlled environment. That is, when safe distancing is observed vis-a-vis other people in the vicinity, and safe management practices are followed throughout the recording or filming process. When face shields are worn on top of a mask, this can provide some additional protection. For example, when there's a need to protect one's eyes from droplets that may also contain virus particles. And this may have also an added benefit we recognize of preventing masks from getting wet in certain external settings. It may also have the advantage of minimizing people touching their face and therefore resulting in further contamination of their hands and of their face itself. Notwithstanding our review of our mask and face shield policy, notwithstanding also the fact that we are resuming many services from tomorrow onwards, we would still advise the general public to stay at home if they are not having anything necessary to do outdoors, to avoid going out as far as is possible. And for those who need to go out, then the wearing a mask with other preventive measures like hand hygiene, safe distancing remain important to help reduce their risk of being exposed, of getting COVID-19 infection, and of spreading COVID-19 infection. We will exercise some flexibility in how we enforce these policies for groups who have those difficulties wearing a face mask or shield. As we mentioned earlier, we recognize that mask wearing is not recommended for young children below the age of 2 for safety reasons, and these exemptions also continue. We urge everyone, therefore, to play their part, continue to follow these safe distancing rules, wear their masks, observe good personal hygiene, and adhere to these measures as recommended.
Thank you. Now I invite Minister Josephine Teo to talk about housing for migrant workers going forward.
Right. Good evening. There's been very significant progress in the recovery operations of our migrant workers' dormitories. By today, around 40,000 migrant workers who were dormitory residents would have been cleared of COVID-19 infections. Let me just tell you a little bit about this 40,000. About 12,000 of them are essential workers that have already moved out of the dormitories into other short-term accommodation previously. They've been tested, they've been cleared, and they've continued to work. Now, more than 20,000 workers have recovered and have been rehoused at various temporary sites. Then we have another 8,000 who are workers living in all the dormitories that we have. These workers have either tested negative or were tested positive, but have fully recovered and been discharged. And they are now living with their fellow workers who have also been cleared of the virus in the dormitories. So this is the makeup, the composition of those 40,000 migrant workers that have been cleared of COVID-19 infections, and they can actually all resume work. Now, at the same time, the interagency task force will be giving the first batch of 60 dormitories cleared status from tomorrow. This first batch consists of 3 purpose-built dormitories, 57 factory-converted dormitories and construction temporary quarters. Now, what does it mean to say that a dormitory has been cleared? It means that every block in that dormitory has been cleared, and what it means is that every resident in those blocks have been cleared of COVID-19 infection. So that's very remarkable progress made by the interagency task force to get us onto the recovery phase. Now, in order to facilitate the safe return of work or to work for these workers, the interagency task force has first enhanced the medical support for the migrant workers. We've started on a program of systematic and regular testing and enhanced health surveillance. And the purpose of these are to enable early detections of any infection, and of course, in the case of the cleared workers, the reinfections, and we want to minimize the risk of widespread transmission. The task force has also worked with dorm operators and employers to put in place a series of safe working, safe living, and even safe rest days measures. And in the months ahead, to properly manage the safe resumption of work, the MOM, the Interagency Task Force, have also worked with DSTA and GovTech to create new technology solutions. One of these new technology solutions is an access code feature on the SG WorkPass app. Now, almost all of our migrant workers have downloaded the SG WorkPass app. And this new access code feature will allow the workers themselves, their employers, as well as the dormitory operators to have clarity about who can exit the dormitories to work. You need to have a green status, you have to have a green code showing up on the SG WorkPass that says you have been cleared, you have met all the conditions, which include your employers having been granted approval to resume operations, and the dormitory that you are living in is also cleared. These conditions must be met in order for the worker to be able to resume work safely. And how do we know whether these conditions have been met? The SG WorkPass, with this new additional feature of access code, will give clarity to all the parties involved. And these efforts are very important and also necessary to protect the health of the migrant workers as well as their co-workers and the community at large. So that's a summary of the recovery operations, the progress that we have made, and how we are preparing for resumption of work. Now, at this stage, we are also planning ahead for the longer term. At the start of the outbreak, I had said that we will look into how we could improve and raise the standards in our migrant worker dormitories. The dormitories allow the migrant workers to be in the company of friends, to cook, to eat, to relax, and even pray together. Now, given Singapore's land constraints, dormitories are also a practical approach to housing some of our migrant workers. Now, this is unlikely to change. What will need to change, however, are the specifications as well as the management of the dormitories, including the daily living habits of the dormitory residents. The changes will be necessary to better protect the workers from widespread transmission and to strengthen the resilience of the dormitories against pandemic risks, such as those posed by COVID-19, which is something we have never experienced before. Minister Lawrence Wong will talk about how much more dormitory capacity we are planning for, both in the short as well as the longer term. In particular, the building up of temporary dormitories, additional temporary dormitories in the short term, presents us with a very good opportunity to pilot new standards. And what this does is to allow us to test things out before we decide on the specifications of the permanent new dormitories that will be built. Now, we have outlined what the new specifications are for the new short-term accommodation options that are coming up, the quick-build dormitories, and this is covered in the press release, so I won't go through every one of the features, but to say that you can compare it with the current standards that are a requirement already. Let me just emphasize a few points with regards to the testing out of these new specifications. The first is that our overall aim is to strengthen resilience against pandemic risks. So it is not just that we try and reduce the risk of widespread transmission, but how we can respond more effectively when there is an outbreak. So these two objectives have to be met, not just to reduce the risk of transmission, but if an outbreak happens, you need to be able to respond more effectively. The second point is that we should really work on the assumption that the risk will always be present in a dormitory, just like the risk is present in any household. A dormitory will always be a big household, and you can make sure that fewer people share the same room or facilities like kitchen or bathrooms, but there must also be discipline in the practice of hygiene and segregation. On luxury cruise ships and even aircraft carriers, the virus can spread easily. And in those settings, room arrangements, you don't have many people sharing. And in aircraft carriers, certainly the discipline level will be quite high. So we must be under no illusion that any specifications on their own will get the job done. The third point is therefore why the pilot is not just about new dorm specifications. That's actually the easier part. It is about how safe living practices can be made a new way of life in the dormitories, where the residents can cook safely, eat safely, relax safely. These are the things that we are looking to do. The dormitories will also have to be managed differently, with operators helping to instill a higher degree of discipline. For example, on intermixing and ensuring tight isolation of infected workers, if and when that happens. And we will work closely with the dormitory operators as well as the employer groups in the construction, marine, and process manufacturing sectors on the quick-build dormitories. And as this is a pilot, we expect it to be an iterative process with refinements as we go along. Through the pilot, we will also assess the effectiveness, scalability, and sustainability of the new standards. At the end of the day, these are the necessary steps that we have to take to keep the workers and the community safe and to allow Singaporeans to be able to continue to benefit from the migrant workers' contributions. Thank you.
Good evening. I will just expand a little bit more on what Minister Teo had just shared on our building program for new dormitories as well as improved dormitories. This will be a major building program that we are putting in place to build additional capacity with higher standards. Our aim is to reduce the density of the dormitories, but also, importantly, to design new dormitories in a way that will be more resilient to public health risk, particularly the risk of pandemics, learning from the COVID-19 experience. For now, we have been using sites like army camps and sports halls, as well as some vacant HDB flats to decant workers to these sites in order to reduce the density of the dormitories. But these are temporary solutions because eventually these sites will have to be returned to their original users. And therefore, we need more sustainable solutions for new dormitory solutions. So we have to do this across different time frames. In the short to medium term, we plan to put in place something close to around 60,000 bed spaces, and this could be done potentially by the end of the year in order to provide additional housing. And that would include building quick dorms. These are semi-permanent structures that you can assemble quite quickly in a matter of months, and we will be able to provide housing for workers for about 25,000 workers through the building of these quick dorms. And we have provided a list of sites where these quick dorms will be located. We will also be identifying several unused state properties where we think with some fitting out, these unused vacant state properties could also provide housing for workers for several years. And these would also be useful short to medium term solutions. And again, we've provided a listing of where these sites are. Not comprehensive because we may update and add to this list along the way, but our preliminary list of sites are indicated in the annex to the statement. And then thirdly, we have many contractors who have already come forward, who have said that they would prefer to house their workers on site in temporary quarters on site, because then you would avoid the need for transportation. All the workers associated with the project can be housed together. So they are very keen to set up some temporary accommodations for their workers in this manner. So we are working with the contractors to identify space, the requirements, and to see how many of these new temporary sites can be set up over the coming months. All in all, we think this will provide about 60,000 additional spaces, and this can be done by the end of the year, thereabouts. Beyond this, in the longer term, we will build new permanent purpose-built dormitories. And we aim to build about 100,000 additional spaces with new designs, new standards, along the lines that what Minister Teo had shared earlier. This longer-term plan will take time, but we will do our best to put them in place soon. And so we expect to build about 11 new purpose-built dormitories within the next 2 years. And that should already account for something close to 60,000 workers. And then the rest can be done later. So it will be a sequential move because the short to medium-term housing can be good for a few years. And then eventually some of these sites too will have to be used or released for other reasons, other purposes, and eventually the workers can move to these new purpose-built dormitory sites. The sites for these new permanent purpose-built dormitories are still being worked out, and as and when we have these details, we will release them to the public. The idea is that when we have this additional capacity in place, we can also decant workers from the existing dormitories so that they can move to these new dormitories, these new permanent dormitories, and then we can put in place an upgrading program for the existing dormitories. So in fact, we are building capacity in excess of what we need in order for such decantment to happen down the road, and an upgrading process can also take place for the existing dormitories in order to lift them to the newer standards. So this is a major building program that we are putting in place. You should see this in the context of how we have continually been upgrading dormitory standards in Singapore. It's not the first time. The new dormitories today that are already in use are already better than the older dormitories. And so now that we are making another major program, putting that in place, we will, in the next batch of dormitory sites, achieve even better standards. So this is something that the government is committed to do, but I would also say that Singaporeans have to do our part as well, because in land-scarce Singapore, it is inevitable that some of these new dormitory sites would be quite near residential areas. So all of us must do our part by rejecting the not in my backyard mindset, we really need to appreciate the contributions of all that our migrant workers have been doing and will continue to do in building Singapore, and welcome them as part of our community. And this is an important part of how we can also learn from this whole experience and become a more inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the floor?
Thank you, panelists. We will now begin with the Q&A. Members of the media, please remember to use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question. Please only ask one question to allow more to participate in the Q&A. Can we have the first question from Yen Lang from SC, please?
Hi. Can the task force please elaborate on how it intends to prevent reinfections at the cleared dormitories, especially factory-component dorms and construction temporary quarters, which may be more difficult to monitor, as well as what are the working safe off-day procedures? Thank you.
Progressively, we have issued a whole series of advisories on safe working, safe living, safe rest days, measures. Maybe just for a quick recap, I think the simple idea is that you cannot go back to the practices of the past. We are going to have to instill greater discipline in the way the workers interact with one another. So when it comes to their interactions at the workplaces, there will be many more requirements for them to work in split teams. There will need to be cohorting, for example, of the use of various facilities at the workplace, at the work sites in particular. So BCA has provided very detailed guidance on what needs to happen at the work sites. Now, if you recall, we have also talked about the safe distancing measures that need to be implemented within the dormitories to ensure safe living. This will include things like ensuring that there are barriers erected between the different blocks so that the residents of different blocks don't mix. It's the simple concept of, well, when you and I go home every day, our household maybe consists of another 3, 4, 5 people. But for the migrant workers, when they go home to the dormitories, their home is a much bigger home with many more members that they get to interact with. So if you want to reduce the risk, you've got to find a way to do so that the interactions are brought to a minimal level. So intermixing between the blocks, we've got to find a way to manage it better. And then the use of communal facilities, where those are the ways in which the workers prepare their meals. And also, for example, using only designated toilets for each of the workers and wash basins. So safe living kinds of measures being implemented at the dormitories. And then last week, on Saturday, we issued a series of advice to operators, dormitory operators, as well as the employers and the workers themselves on what kinds of guidelines will be implemented on their rest days. So things like staggering the rest days, and also then, not immediately, because in phase 1, even on rest days, the advice, the requirement is for the workers to stay in the dormitories. But when we get to phase 2, then they will be able to go out to run errands. But we would want these errands to be run in smaller groups rather than everyone going out at the same time. So there will have to be a system to stagger the times at which they go out. Now, so all of these measures have to be put together, and each one of them actually requires everyone to do things differently than they did before. Now, I should just say this. When we look at what's going to happen in the dormitories, and I mentioned to you that we are also implementing the access code, which will facilitate how these workers can safely resume work. When you put all of these things together, new habits need to be formed, and essentially everyone has to be much more vigilant than before. But we still have to be mindful that in spite of all these measures, the risks of reinfections for the workers individually and the risks of clusters forming remain for us to be very careful about. We cannot assume that with these measures, there will be no reinfections for either the individual worker or for clusters of workers living in dormitories. The risk of infections remain there. What we therefore need to layer on also is a rigorous system to test the workers regularly. And that is something that we've committed to do and which we will work out operationally how to carry it out.
Can I also just add that because these are all very new requirements for all the contractors, including for the government to regulate and put in place these new infection controls, it really requires patience on the part of every party to work through these guidelines systematically. I appreciate that many contractors are very eager to resume work. I also appreciate that many individuals are very eager for their contractors to resume work, especially on renovation projects. But again, we do want these works to resume as soon as possible, but we also have to make sure that the requirements are met and the works are done safely. So let's all work through the necessary precautions and safeguards. There are quite a few of them, but we believe they are necessary, and we will work with the contractors too, because some of these on the ground, the contractors themselves may come up with innovative ideas, better ideas based on their own experience. They may have different ways of doing it to achieve the same safe outcome. So we will also listen to their feedback and then work through all the processes to ensure that construction work resumes safely. It won't be the same as before. It will take some time, but we have to all work together to ensure that this is done in a safe manner.
Thank you, Ministers. Can we have the next question from Yoon To from Taupao, please?
Hi, good afternoon. Just like to see a quick clarification on with regards to the position on using face masks vis-a-vis face shields. So, what will be the guidelines for hawker stores? Are they still going to be wearing face shields, or are there different regulations that we'll be looking at? Thank you.
Thank you. Hawker stalls will have to wear masks going forward, and they have been wearing masks. I think they will continue to have to wear masks because they are in close contact with customers, and they're also in close proximity of fellow workers. So in that environment, they will have to wear masks.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Tessa from Today, please?
Hi, Ministers. My question is on the new regulations on the face shields and face masks. So I understand that DSTA actually made face shields for non-healthcare frontline workers. And I want to understand, with this new policy, does it mean that these frontline workers who are not from the healthcare sector will not be able to wear face shields anymore and will have to wear face masks?
I'll ask the DMS to elaborate, but many of these non-healthcare frontline workers are actually in constant contact with a potential suspect cases or in fact confirmed COVID-19 cases. So many of these are, for example, security guards. Some of them may be cleaning workers and so on, maintenance or management of a dormitory. These are frontline workers which are not necessarily healthcare workers, but they are in the same similar situation as healthcare workers, and therefore they will need adequate protection. And in fact, for them, mask is quite essential. And over and above mask, the face shield actually provide additional protection for their eyes, because the mask only cover your nose and your mouth, and your eyes may be exposed. For healthcare workers which are in close work with COVID-19 patients, they sometimes wear goggles. But goggles may not be practical for some of these non-healthcare frontline workers, and therefore face shields will provide a useful protection for them against droplets that may get into their eyes. So I think face shield will also continue to play an important role in conjunction with masks. Maybe DMS can elaborate.
Yes, we're quite familiar with the face shields that are produced by DSTA, and there are also face shields that are produced by various other commercial sources, commercial vendors as well. Some of these face shields, of course, have different designs. Some meet the requirements that we've talked about, but not all do. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have reviewed our policies. We now require the face mask to be the default. And therefore, in other than the settings which I mentioned earlier as exemptions, in all other settings, the face mask must be worn. The face shields may be worn to augment the use of face masks to provide additional eye protection. But in those other settings, the face shield can no longer replace the use of a mask.
Thank you, panelists. Can we have the next question from Stefania from the Financial Times?
Hi, good afternoon. I wanted to ask a follow-up question on a paragraph in the press release, which says that the government is basically studying the possibility of developing these new purpose-built dormitories in a different model, which currently involves essentially the land being released to commercial operators that sort of build and operate these structures. So are you considering having the government take over the building and even maybe the operation of these dorms? And also if there's any way you could comment on the cost that you say obviously will be generated as these new measures are rolled out. How much, very ballpark, are we talking about, and who would be taking on these costs? Are you referring to the government specifically or to the private sector?
Well, we've said that we are studying these models. There are possibilities that we are looking at. For example, it could be done on a build, own, and lease model where the government builds and owns the asset, but the leasing and the operations of the dormitory is done through a separate entity. Doesn't have to be the government, it could be a private entity, it could be an NGO or a VWO, a voluntary organization. So these are different models that exist today, even in the running of various entities in Singapore, right? So we will study what's the best way of doing it, and then this eventually come to a decision on how best to progress with these new permanent dormitories that we are building. The cost will indeed be higher, so we will have to, again, as part of this study, work out what's the way to manage the cost increases. Certainly employers, dormitory operators will have to bear part of this increase in cost, and in the transition, the government may well look at providing some support as a transitionary measure. So these are details that we are still studying, but we wanted to put out the plans, the broad plans that are in the pipeline, so everyone knows that there is a building program coming up, short term, medium term, but also in the longer term, and the model of operating dormitories for migrant workers in Singapore is likely to go through some changes too, bearing in mind that, as we said, it's not just about building the dormitory itself, it's not just about the hardware. I think we've learned from this experience that an important part of this process for infection control is the management of the dormitories. That's quite critical. So our aim will be to find ways to improve that management capacity in order to ensure that the workers in the dormitories have good living standards, but also are kept safe even through what is likely to be the reality of COVID-19 for quite some time to come.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Mayuko from Nikkei, please?
Yes, hi. Thank you. We heard of the long-term plan for the dormitories, but is this on an assumption of decreased number of foreign workers in mid to long term? If so, what is the the number of the foreign workers that the government is now looking at, and how are you going to decrease it? Is it going to be the similar way as you have been doing through the charges to the construction companies, or will you be coming out with the new ways? Thank you.
If you look at where the bulk of migrant workers are, they are in the construction sector. We have about 320,000 migrant workers in the construction sector. We have over the years, in fact, been trying to reduce that number. It's not a new thing. We've been trying to reduce that number, increase the Singaporean core in this sector. But we also have to be, and actually we have made some progress. We give out scholarships every year for the built environment, and we've got good take-up of these scholarships from our graduates from our institutes of higher learning at the ITE, the polytechnics, and even the universities, and they take on a different range of jobs from architects to engineers to project managers and even BIM modelers, because nowadays the built environment is also embarking on more automated and modern and digital processes for building. So this is already happening. But there is still a lot of construction work that is required, manual work that is required at the construction work sites. And it is very hard to find locals to fill these jobs. So I think it will not be realistic to talk about doing away entirely without migrant workers in the construction sector. We will still need them, but we will continue with our push for a reduction in the numbers, and we will continue to give a bigger push towards our automation and prefabricated initiatives that is already happening in the built environment. More and more projects are now done through automation, through prefab and precast methods. And we will give that a bigger push, and by doing so, we will also be able to reduce the reliance on migrant workers.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Su Hui from CNA, please?
Hi, could I find out how many workers are expected to be housed in each dormitory, and how large would they have to be given the aim of reducing density?
Can you repeat your question again?
How many workers are expected to be housed in each dormitory, and how large would they have to be with the aim of reducing density?
The dormitories range, there's a very wide range of capacities that the dormitories can hold, so it will depend on the specific circumstances at each dormitory. But the point to keep in mind is this: the intention is to reduce the density in every single dormitory. Now, there are already some dormitories that have not filled, all of their bed spaces. So we will have to take a look at the specific circumstances in each dormitory. But the overall direction is quite clear. We would like to reduce the dorm density.
So it would, based on density, it would depend on the size of each plot of land, right? For example, in the quick-built dormitories that we are talking about, depending on the size of the land, because we have certain now requirements for density, then depending on the size of the land, it could take anything from 2,000 to 3,000 workers. It varies. And then for the permanent built dormitories, we are still locating the sites, but depending on the size, depending on how big the site is, it could take up to 5,000 workers potentially. Right? So it's not just about the numbers, the absolute numbers, because the absolute numbers together with the size, the land that you have, and how high you build, or how intense how much space you build, then you would derive the density. And our aim is to have less dormitories that are less dense than before. And again, as I said, design to be able to be more resilient to public health risk and pandemic risk.
I should perhaps elaborate that it is not just a matter of the density. It is also how we design the dormitory to be able to allow us to have a segregation, to have isolation to some extent. Even if you have a dormitory of 5,000, can we design it so that at any point in time, it's 1,000 in groups so that you're able to separate them to minimize the risk of a cross-infection. So to a very large extent, beyond just the density number, it is also how you design the dormitory and how do you operationalize the infection control system measures on the ground. How can we segregate the workers so that we can minimize the risk of infection, cross-infection between blocks, between floors, and between dormitories. So I think this is a comprehensive review to design a dormitory that's more resilient, both in terms of density as well as infection control measures that we will put in place.
So a lot of work is ongoing now, and at some point, when we are ready, we will be able to share, for example, the designs. The work will be, there's work happening even now to engage designers, architects, stakeholders on what are appropriate designs that will help us achieve these outcomes. You can appreciate that it will be quite involved, but we are already starting, and when we have more updates, we will be able to share with the public.
Thank you, panelists. Can we have the next question from Polling from Channel 8, please?
Hi, Ministers. I have a question on the face shield. I was wondering, so moving forward from tomorrow onwards, people have to wear masks. So what happens if someone wears a face shield? Will there be any penalties? Like, will they be fined, or what will happen to them?
We've instructed, I think, those who are going around policing, our safe distancing ambassadors, to exercise some flexibility in how they will do enforcement. The aim really, at the onset, is to educate, to encourage people to do the right thing and do the right behavior. And as people learn about the importance of wearing masks as a default, we believe that more and more people will be, in fact, doing the right practice, even though they may previously have been quite accustomed and used to the use of face shields in lieu of a mask. So the beginning, I think, would be more opportunities for correction for people then to learn what the new rules are. So some flexibility in enforcement will take place. But certainly we identify people who are recalcitrant, not wearing masks when they should be wearing masks, and despite encouragement and education still persisting, then certainly these are situations where we will have to enforce.
I should add that the wearing of masks will become mandatory as a default whenever you go out and leave your home. But again, as I mentioned during the last press conference, we have to understand the spirit of the rule and not just to try to follow the letter of the law and try to find ways to get around it. It gives us no joy to penalize someone who doesn't wear a mask, because the ultimate penalty is for the person to be infected with COVID-19. So it is important for us to understand the reason why we want to insist that masks should be the default. This is to protect individuals and to protect your loved ones and to protect your friends and your co-workers that are around you, and also to protect the customers that you are serving. So I think in all aspects, it is important for us to bear in mind, masks, the requirement to wear masks is for protection. It's not something that we want to impose additional burden on individual. We know wearing masks is very uncomfortable, especially you need to wear it the whole day long, including hawkers. We can understand that under the circumstances it's very, very challenging, but it is important to do so. And we have been in touch with various agencies on how to implement this on the ground. And we hope that Singaporeans will cooperate with us, not to, I think, just because there's a penalty, but do it because it is a safety measure that we are putting in place to benefit you and your loved ones, as well as your co-workers and your customers.
Thank you, panelists. Can we have the next question from Aradhana from Reuters, please?
So we are anticipating an announcement on the decision to hold the F1 this week from the organizers, and Straits Times had reported that preparations were going ahead for the race, anticipating a live audience. the organizers have said that it's not feasible to have the race without a live audience. So I just wondered, what does the Singapore government think about the viability of holding large events like the F1 with crowds in coming months? And what does that mean for other sporting events, say, such as the rugby sevens and musical events?
Maybe can you repeat your question? The volume wasn't so good. So just very quickly, what exactly was the question again? I heard F1 and large crowds, but that was about it.
No worries, no worries. So we are anticipating the announcement on the decision to hold the F1 this week from the organizers. Also, Straits Times had reported that preparations were going ahead for the race, anticipating a live audience. The F1 organizers have said it's not feasible to have the race without a live audience. So I wondered, what does the Singapore government think about the viability of holding large events like the F1 with crowds in coming months? And what does that mean for other sporting events such as rugby sevens and musical events?
Yeah. So again, this whether or not the F1 proceeds is between the organizers and the F1, right? So it's nothing to do with the government. But as far as the task force is concerned, we will put in place the requirements and the rules for what we would consider appropriate depending on the assessment of the situation. F1 is in September. It's very hard for me to tell you what's going to apply in September today because it's, situation is so uncertain and so fluid. What we have said, and that certainly by then we'll be in phase 2, and because phase 2 we've said by end of this month, before perhaps we might even move into phase 2. But with phase 2, remember we've said gatherings of 5 people. 5! That's certainly not a large crowd. So we are not anticipating anything at the start of phase 2 that would come even close to a large crowd. All right? Because we are talking about 5 people maximum. Beyond the start of phase 2, of course, if the situation permits, if conditions are favorable, if the community infection remains under control, we could expand the limit of 5 people to a larger number, and we could, as we have explained before, potentially allow some gatherings, events to happen subject to appropriate measures, appropriate safe distancing measures, including making sure people are separate from one another, density of the venue is not overcrowded, those sorts of things. It's possible in phase 2, but exactly when this can happen and whether the conditions would permit, it's very uncertain. So we wouldn't be able to tell anyone at this stage whether it is possible or not in September. And I think that's the uncertainty that lies ahead, and the organizers know full well that there is uncertainty and they will have to make their own decisions on the event, recognizing this uncertainty is present.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Philip from Bloomberg, please?
Hi, panelists. So we've seen the press release over the weekend regarding renewed travel between, or rather, implementation of fast lanes between China and Singapore. So, I wonder if there's anything more concrete you can tell us at this point between travel plans with other countries, and also whether if you'll be assessing on a regional level with ASEAN that kind of travel plans, or whether that's being done on a country-to-country basis within Southeast Asia. Thank you.
We've highlighted the understanding of a green lane with China. We've said that we are exploring with other countries, and we have also provided some broad description of what a green lane protocol would entail. Essential idea, as we've said before, is testing. But from departure, perhaps at arrival too, and then verification of the test. And at the same time, with the test results, then there is no need for a quarantine period. And then at the same time, when the person is within the country, we will need some mechanism to be able to track where that person is using the Trace Together app. So those are the basic ideas, quite straightforward. The numbers that we're talking about will be controlled. right? And so we will have to control the numbers, and they will be limited for essential travel for work reasons. So that's the broad concept. China, we've reached an agreement. We've highlighted a few other countries, whether it's Korea or New Zealand, that we have been also, Malaysia, that we are discussing the Green Lane arrangements with. Certainly, as we expand the scope of these bilateral discussions at some stage within ASEAN, you could consider some sort of a regional green lane, and for that matter, within a broader grouping than ASEAN in Asia itself, you could consider a broader travel bubble, right? So these are, all possibilities that can be considered. So we are doing it sequentially, step by step. I think starting from, it's very much like when we're talking about FTAs, free trade agreements started bilaterally, and then eventually you had regional groupings. So I think some of these ideas of green lane and travel bubbles, a lot of discussions are happening now at the bilateral level, but in time to come, I'm quite sure we can expand it to a regional concept as well.
Thank you, Minister. Can we have the next question from Jane from Mothership, please?
Hi, sorry, we actually just received the press release. I was going to ask about the number of beds, whether the MOM will be considering limiting the number of beds per room in the dormitories as we move towards a more resilient dormitory kind of setup. I saw that in the press release it says less than 10, so I was wondering whether you can elaborate a bit more on the plans that have to do with that. Thank you.
It will have to depend on the size of the room. But what we are saying is that even if you are able to set aside, 6 square meters per worker in a room, then you must make sure that they are able to accommodate beds, single-decker beds that are at least a meter apart. So it will go into how the dormitories are being designed, and that's the purpose of testing out these specifications in the quick build dorms. I think it's quite important to re-emphasize the point. It's not just going to be the rooming arrangements where the workers sleep. It has to be the whole system of how you can minimize the risk of transmission. So whilst the rooming requirements give us a sense of the level of density that we hope to move towards, I expect that the designs will come up with, there will be a range of designs. So even though we have said that we don't want to see more than 10 workers in every single room, it may well be that in terms of the design, individual dorms have actually got different configurations that have fewer workers in the rooms. So they are just a guideline. They represent the boundaries, the requirements that we want the architects together with the engineers that are working on this to keep in mind, and we will have to see what kind of designs they come up with. But directionally, it is to signal to them that we would like fewer people in a room, even if the room is very large.
Thank you, Minister. We now have time for 2 last questions. Can we have the next question from Venga from Tamil Marisa, please?
Hi, I just have a quick question on the incomes and the job stability for migrant workers. I think with the ongoing recession and the fact that a lot of the contractors and companies, especially the smaller ones, are possibly facing reduction in their income. There's a potential that they could close down, and the job security. I don't think anyone in Singapore can. Job security is always an issue, and so for these workers, how would you go about taking care of these workers who have lost their jobs? Maybe would you provide them new employment opportunities, or because a lot of them they come in with debt, and so how do we plan to maintain the job security for these migrant workers? Yeah, thank you.
We've put in place a number of measures. One of the first things that we have done is to lighten the burden on the employers during this period of a circuit breaker by waiving the foreign workers' levies that they would otherwise have paid. And during the circuit breaker period, we also provided the employers with rebates on their foreign worker levies, and this is to enable the employers to continue to fulfill their obligations to their workers during this period. In other words, we want the employers to have the ability to still continue to pay some salary. So those are the things that we have done, and you would have read announcement that even in the month of June, the levies continue to be waived, and there is also the same rate of rebate that we have implemented for 2 months before. And from July, however, for those companies that are able to resume work, then these levy waivers and rebates will no longer apply. But for the companies that can still not resume operations, then they will continue to enjoy the levy rebates and the waiver. There will, however, come a time where between the employer and the workers, they will have to assess the viability of continuing to have the workers stay in Singapore if work cannot resume. That will depend from company to company, and however, in any case, I think the expectation is that there ought to be fair treatment. And the fair treatment means that you have to consider the circumstances of the workers and try and help as best as possible. One of the ways in which to help is to allow the worker to be transferred to another employer. We have made this possible. We have facilitated it. Very early on, actually, we worked with the Singapore Business Federation to create a system where employers who had access foreign workers could let this be known to other employers. And these other employers can then, through this system, reach out and try and work out an arrangement for the workers to be transferred. This system remains in place, and it's been extended to cover foreign workers of all nationalities, migrant workers of all nationalities, and they can come from any sector. The transfer of employment may be within the same sector, and we've also adapted our rules to enable transfer of workers to other sectors, because you can imagine that an employer in one sector, if he's not able to sustain business, it is quite possible that other employers are also not able to sustain. Therefore, what we have done is to enable the employers to transfer the workers to other sectors that may still be in need. So those are the things that we need to look at, and we will continue to facilitate. But there will come a point that even with all of these measures in place, the workers themselves may miss home and want to return. And this is where we will continue to work with the foreign missions in Singapore and engage our counterparts in the home countries of these workers to try and best to facilitate the workers who wish to return home. We can understand that desire, and we hope that our counterparts can also be facilitative towards the strong interest of some of the workers to return home.
Thank you, Minister. For our last question, can we have Jalila from CNA, please? I'm sorry, Jalila, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Just want to check specifically on penalties. Will people face the same penalties for wearing a face shield as if they were not wearing a mask?
Yes, I think the requirement is to wear a mask. If you are not wearing a mask, then you will be face the same penalty as if you are not wearing a mask.